Welcome to Seamwork Radio. I'm Sari, the founder of Seamwork.
And I'm Haley, the pattern designer.
And in these weekly episodes, we share easy tips and fun ideas to tackle all those little sewing and creative conundrums that we all face. This podcast is brought to you by Seamwork, a community that supports you in designing and sewing your very own wardrobe. When you join us at Seamwork, not only do you get to take part in an amazing, super helpful online community, but you also get access to new sewing patterns and classes every single month. We have over 200 sewing patterns to choose from and new designs that we add every month. So we'll help you to make things that fit your style, and you'll have more fun sewing. You can ask questions in our private community or join us for one of our monthly sew-along classes. As a podcast listener, you can get half off an unlimited membership by going to seamwork.com/go/podcast50. Okay, hi everyone, and welcome to episode 27. And today we're talking about where to look for vintage and dead stock fabric. So recently we had a really active thread on the Seamwork community about this, and there were a ton of resources and ideas that were posted there. So we wanted to talk today about what dead stock fabric really is and round up a few of those resources that came out of that discussion. So we'll put a link to the whole thread in the show notes. So if you're a Seamwork member, you'll be able to check it out. But we're going to cover some of the benefits and drawbacks of three different kinds of fabric: dead stock, vintage, and secondhand. And we'll give a bunch of resources for finding these kinds of fabric, either online or locally. So I mentioned there's this thread in the community, and I believe the title is, "What are your favorite sources for vintage and dead stock fabric in person and online?" So that's a big subject, and there are so many great recommendations in there. No matter where you are in the world, there's like tons of recommendations in there. But I thought today we could talk about what is dead stock fabric, what is vintage fabric, what is secondhand fabric, and generally, where do you find it?
Yeah, so Sari, can you explain for us what is dead stock?
I will try. So dead stock refers to fabric that is basically overages at the mill. So the mill produces the fabric, and when they have fabric left over, that's referred to as dead stock. So the thing about dead stock fabric is that sometimes it is positioned as being a more sustainable alternative to other types of fabric, especially in the ready-to-wear industry, because the claim is that because it's an overage, it would otherwise end up in a landfill. And so when you buy something that's made from dead stock fabric, that means you're keeping that fabric out of the landfill. And so it's considered a more sustainable option. But there's this great article on a website called Virtue and Vice, and I'll link it in the show notes, that really questions whether it is a more sustainable option, because the truth of the garment industry is that these overages are actually produced somewhat intentionally to have this extra fabric at the end that can then be sold in another market. So then that is sold to jobbers, people called jobbers, and the jobbers can then sell that to designers, or they can sell it to your favorite fabric stores. So that's where actually a lot of fabric stores get their fabrics. So when you see designer fabrics or dead stock fabrics in fabric stores online or in person, that's kind of what that is. So they also point out in that article that sometimes these fabrics are actually designer rejects. So they could be fabrics that have flaws, maybe a printing flaw, or maybe they didn't pass stress testing. Maybe they're going to form holes. So that's one reason why it's important that when you're buying these fabrics, you go with a reputable source for buying them. So you're not buying something that's just going to fall apart.
Mm-hmm. And also, could you explain for us what is vintage? I know we were talking about this before, like what's vintage? What's antique? What's all this?
Yeah. I think that the terms are kind of loosey-goosey, really. Like, I don't think there's any hard definition of what's considered vintage, what's considered antique. The things I've read online, vintage is considered something that's at least 20 years old. So as opposed to dead stock, which just might have been produced pretty recently, or it might have been produced a long time ago, vintage is something that is, by some definition, at least a couple decades old. Whereas antique Some people say it's something that's over 50 years old. Some people say over 100 years old, but antique is just, that's something that's quite old.
Really old.
Real
It's
old.
nice to think that the jeans I wore in 2001 are now vintage.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. They were low rise and now they're vintage.
Has that come back in style yet? Are people wearing low-rise jeans yet?
I think it's coming back. Remember the zippers that were like 2 inches
Yes.
long?
Yes.
I
Oh.
also had a pair that like laced up. Oh God.
That's very Shakira.
I thank you. I thought so in 2003 or something. Not quite vintage, I guess. Not
I
not
don't
that
I
there
don't
yet.
I don't think I'll ever go back to low-rise jeans. They
Nope.
just do not work for me.
Yeah, I like feeling nice and secure. I like my lunch held tightly.
Yeah.
Okay. And then lastly, secondhand. Tell us about secondhand.
Okay, so as a term, secondhand just means pre-owned, basically. So these terms all kind of overlap because something could be vintage and secondhand, or it could just be secondhand, just meaning that somebody had it before you did. So that's often a really sustainable choice because it means usually you're buying something that might have otherwise gone to waste, somebody's leftover fabric or something that used to belong to somebody and now they don't want it anymore. So by definition, you're most likely keeping it out of the landfill.
Yeah, definitely.
So there's, like I said, this whole thread in the community. If you're a member and there's somebody in the community that compiled a whole huge list of places to get dead stock fabric in North America. So if you're a member, definitely check that out. And again, we'll put it in the show notes. But I thought I would round up some of the top picks that were in that thread. The first one was our friends over at Blackbird. Blackbird's located in Canada. And by the way, you can get a Seymour discount when you order from Blackbird. If you're a member, we have discounts for many of these fabric stores. But I love Blackbird. I've gotten so many awesome things from Blackbird.
They're my fave, one of my favorites for sure.
Yeah, they always have beautiful stuff. I know my sister was just saying that she loves everything she's ever bought from Blackbird fabric, and I tend to agree. But occasionally they have stuff that's labeled as dead stock fabric specifically. So I guess, we talked a little bit about how dead stock ends up in fabric stores. One thing we could differentiate. So some of the fabric that you might see in an online fabric store is dead stock, but not all of it necessarily is. So some of it might be ordered directly from fabric manufacturers, whether that's somebody who's manufacturing for the home sewing market. So there are companies that manufacture fabric specifically for home sewing, but then there's also companies that manufacture fabric for retail apparel, and fabric stores can also order that fabric as well. And those are the more reorderable fabrics versus the dead stock, which is just kind of like limited supply.
Yeah. And fabric stores like Blackbird and some of the other ones that Sari will get into, it'll always be labeled as designer or dead stock. So you can kind of look out for those indicators to get you some one of a kind dead stock fabric.
Yeah. So Blackbird is a great one. Love them. The next one on the list that came up a lot was Bolt Fabric right here in Portland. Our friends over at Bolt.
I love them too.
We love them. They are amazing people as well as a great fabric store. So they also have some dead stock fabric, and I love everything they sell. They're another one that just has like great stuff. They have great taste.
They do. And I love like a place that has like, they serve the quilters. They have like fun quilting stuff. They also have so much good fashion fabric. I feel like it can be rare to find stores that do both.
Yeah, for sure. And the next one on the list is another old favorite. We've been buying stuff from this place for such a long time. Hearts Fabric.
Yes.
Which is in California. I think it's in Santa Cruz.
Yep, they're in
right?
Santa Cruz. Uh-huh.
I visited them one time. They are just the loveliest people. They are really, really nice as well.
I stumbled across them years ago. I went out to Santa Cruz for my sister-in-law's graduation. She went to the university out there. And I like rounded a corner and was like, oh, it's Hearts. And they like literally, I saw someone turning the sign around right as I was like turning the corner, and I regret, like, oh, I should have just like knocked and said hi. I haven't gone back to Santa Cruz since.
Oh, someday.
Yeah.
I really love Hearts. And it's one of those really huge fabric stores when you visit it in person, which I just love. It's so much fun. But they have a really good stock online as well. They have lots and lots of stuff. It's really fun to shop. The next one that I'll recommend, I don't know if this one made it onto the list actually, but it's one of my personal favorites, which is Emma One Sock. Have you ever shopped from them, Haley?
Yeah, I have bought a handful of sweater knits from them. I think you recommended them to me years ago. They have gorgeous fabric.
Yeah, really, really beautiful fabric. And a lot of it is dead stock. They have a lot of designer dead stock fabric, and they'll put the name of the designer on it. Like they'll obscure the name because maybe they can't like say exactly who manufactured. I don't know. But you can see who the fabric came from. And they just have such beautiful stuff. I just recently bought this gorgeous, it's like a black viscose, I think, fabric with little pink flowers kind of scattered all over it. And it's so nice. I love their stuff.
So your style.
Yeah. And if you get on their mailing list, they usually do like a monthly 15% off discount at the end of the month. And they will email you about new fabrics they get. They're always getting new stuff in. It's really fun. I like Emma One Sock a lot. And then the last one is another personal favorite that I feel like I have a real connection to, which is Stone Mountain and Daughter in Berkeley, California. I used to live in Berkeley, so this was my local fabric store for a long time. And it's just so lovely. It's been there for many, many, many years. And they have great stuff, really knowledgeable staff. It's just a wonderful place to shop. And we buy a lot of our fabric for our samples from them still.
We do. You have listed probably 5 of my like top fabric stores for sure. These are all amazing options who have, and a good variety too. I feel like each of them kind of has their style, their thing. I mean, between these 5, you probably can find whatever your fabric brain can conjure.
Yeah. I think it's so fun to shop for dead stock because you just get really unusual things that you can't find anywhere else. And it makes it hard sometimes because, it's limited quantity. So it makes you want to buy a little bit more than you might otherwise. But there's just so many great options.
Yeah. I think that it's buying dead stock, buying designer fabric. It's a really great way to kind of like elevate the look of your garments. I think that a lot of times these fabrics are a little bit higher quality, and you don't have to buy high quality fabric to make a beautiful garment, but it does not hurt, certainly.
Yeah, and I think the prints and the designs are sometimes more trendy, more fashion forward, which if that's your thing, then you have those options. So
for sure.
And then the next thing I want to talk about is sources for vintage fabric, either online or in person. So vintage fabric is maybe a little bit trickier, but I think for me, the best place to look has always been eBay or Etsy. There are places, you can find stores on there that specifically sell vintage fabric, but I think just doing a search on there, if you know specifically what you're looking for, what era you're looking for, maybe if you're looking for like a 1940s rayon or something like that, to do a search specifically for that. And you can find some really, really good deals on those marketplace type sites. Do you buy a lot of vintage fabric, Haley?
I have vintage fabric. I don't really buy it online. Actually, I don't know if I've ever bought it online. I've browsed, but not bought. All of the vintage in my stash tends to be things that people either gave me or I found in thrift stores, estate sales, things like that.
Yeah, and that's a great place to look when you're looking in person, are thrift stores and estate sales. Or sometimes if you have a reuse center in your area. We have one here in Portland. I had one when we lived in the Bay Area nearby. That's a great place to look. They always have a ton of older fabric at places like that, and patterns sometimes. Another place that you might not think about is antique stores, antique malls, antique shows. My stash of vintage fabric almost entirely came from one antique show I went to here in Portland years ago. And I told you about this, Haley, recently. I just rounded a corner at this antique show I was at. It's like this big, twice annual antique show we have here in Portland. And I rounded a corner and there was a booth that had only vintage fabric. It was an entire booth of vintage fabric, and a lot of it was garment fabric. And it was towards the end of the show, so they were pricing things to move. And I bought so much stuff. I bought silks, I bought vintage rayons. I bought this, still have this yardage of a silk georgette it's like a navy blue with these gigantic big flowers on it, kind of scattered. And it's like 5 yards, but it's in pieces. It's not like one continuous length. So I haven't really ever figured out what to do with it. But antique shows and places like that, you never know what you're going to find. There could always be something, or flea markets, like vintage flea markets. Haley and I both have lived in LA, and there's the Rose Bowl flea market. It's just enormous flea market. You can definitely find stuff at places like that.
Yeah, I think that when you're shopping flea markets, antique shows, there's definitely merits to getting there early. For sure, you obviously have more things to choose from, but you're always going to get the best deals at the end, because nobody wants to pack that stuff back up into their car and head home with it. They'd rather walk away with cash in their pocket. So don't shy away from those kinds of places because you maybe think that they're out of your budget. You can still get some really good deals. And if nothing else, you had a fun day of getting some inspiration.
Yeah. Yeah, I love to haggle. I used to be kind of shy about it, but I think going to enough flea markets and traveling to different places where that's the norm, in different societies, it's really, I like haggling.
Yeah, and at thrift stores too. I mean, not like at places like Goodwill or Salvation Army or like, like the chains, but if you go into like a little mom and pop thrift store, oftentimes you can haggle with them as well.
Yeah. And then the last category we're going to talk about, which is secondhand. And again, there's a lot of overlap here. Vintage is obviously usually secondhand, but secondhand doesn't necessarily mean that it's vintage. So there are a bunch of options here. One thing that you can consider is reusing stuff from thrift stores that isn't really intended to be fabric. So things like bed sheets, you can get so much yardage out of a bed sheet. Or set of bed sheets. You can get just a lot of fabric out of that.
Curtains.
Curtains. Yeah. You can find some really nice interior kind of fabrics for curtain that has been made into curtains that can work really well for things like jackets or skirts, things like that.
Yeah, I have a Gone with the Wind moment. Isn't there a dress made out of curtains in that movie? Somewhere in the long, long length of that movie?
I don't know. Is there? I haven't seen Gone with the Wind in it's probably since I was a kid. But The Sound of Music, doesn't she make?
Yeah. Yes.
Doesn't she make outfits for all of the Von Trapp children out of curtains?
And I take all of my sewing tips and from movies. If you didn't know.
So that is one option. Sometimes you can find fabric at thrift stores. I haven't found tons of great fabrics just sitting on their own in thrift stores, but you can definitely find that stuff occasionally. Another option for looking for vintage fabric or secondhand fabric is looking for the term destash on Etsy. A lot of people, and this is true for yarn and other craft supplies as well, but a lot of people will just sell their leftover stuff on Etsy when they're destashing. And so I think Etsy is a really good place to look for fabric generally. I've found a lot of great stuff on Etsy. And then one person in the community suggested Facebook groups for selling and swapping. I haven't checked any of those out because I'm not on Facebook personally, but that sounds like a great idea. I love the idea of swapping fabric. I feel like we should do a fabric swap or something.
Yeah, we definitely should. And at the office too. I do that a lot with the fabric that we have left over from photo shoots. I guess it's not really a swap. I just leave it out on a chair and tell people to take it.
Yeah, I have some of that fabric still from many, many months ago.
Yeah, fabric never goes to waste here. We always have, things to make.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have so much fabric. I feel like these tips are just going to add to my stash.
Well, then you can listen to the last episode, episode 26, and figure out how to organize all of the stuff that you have
Yeah,
acquired.
I know. Tell me about it. Yeah, but I think swapping is such a great way to get rid of stuff and know that somebody else is going to use it. There's
Hmm.
I just made I posted this project on the community recently, but I just made this whole a set that was a sweatshirt and matching skirt out of like this really nice French terry.
Hmm.
And it's lovely, but I have over a yard of it left. And I made some baby clothes for somebody I know who's having a baby. And I still have like quite a bit of it left. And I was looking at it yesterday and I was just like, I don't want like a whole matching wardrobe of like blue French terry. So I need to find somebody else who's going to love this because it's a great fabric.
Yeah.
So yeah. Yeah. So those are some great places to look for secondhand fabric, both online and in person. So just to kind of recap what we talked about today, we talked about the difference between dead stock, vintage, and secondhand. So dead stock is overages from the fabric mill, could be brand new fabric, never been used before. And that often you can find in fabric stores as designer dead stock. It could be labeled dead stock or designer fabric. We talked about vintage fabric, which is anything over, let's say, about 20 years. And then we talked about secondhand fabric, which is anything that has basically just been pre-owned, might be vintage, might not be vintage. And these are all options you can consider if you're thinking about sustainability and reuse. So we recommended a bunch of resources, most of them in North America, but they ship. I think all of these places probably ship worldwide. I'm not sure, but I think so. But we'll link to them in the show notes so you can check them out. But if you're a Seamwork member, be sure to check out the thread on the Seamwork community because there's just so many great recommendations there and fabric stores that you probably have never seen before that have some really, really great stuff. So for vintage online, I'd recommend eBay or Etsy. That's probably my top recommendation. Oh, there was one other recommendation in the community that I didn't mention for vintage online, which is a place called A Thrifty Notion. And that is an online sort of fabric thrift store.
Oh, cool.
So that's really cool. I haven't bought anything from them yet, but we'll link it in the show notes and you can check it out because they have some really cool older fabric and it seemed like they had some good apparel stuff. And then for secondhand, look on places like Etsy for destash for people who are destashing their fabric. And there's lots and lots of stuff that you can find there. And then we also recommended to reuse other stuff like bed sheets and things like that you can find at the thrift store. And then maybe you could organize a fabric swap. Maybe we'll organize a fabric swap.
Yeah,
We'll do
maybe.
something in the community. That'd be really fun.
It would be.
Good way to get rid of some stuff and get something new. So cool. Well, I hope this has been helpful for you guys and you get some new resources out of this. Definitely check out the links in the show notes, though. I think you'll have fun exploring them.
Yeah, I'm going to go check out A Thrifty Notion. That sounds amazing.
Yeah, cool. All right. We'll talk to you guys soon.
Bye.
See you next week. Bye. Seamwork Radio is brought to you by our team here at Seamwork. You can follow us on Instagram at Seamwork or find lots of free sewing videos on our YouTube channel at Seamwork Video. You might also want to check out our free sewing quiz, which is at seamwork.com. When you take the quiz, you answer just a few questions about your goals and your personality, and we'll tell you what kind of sewer you are and recommend some patterns and resources for you to achieve your sewing goals, no matter what they are. And don't forget, if you're interested in a Seamwork membership, podcast listeners get half off our unlimited plan. Just go to seamwork.com/go/podcast50 to get that deal. Until next time, have fun sewing.